But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. Jesus, in Luke's Gospel, chapter 6, comes to the most radical part of his program here, the love of enemies. In all my years of teaching both in undergrads and churches, nothing is harder for people to hear than this command. But I hope as we go through this session here, and I won't try to get through the entire unit that I suggested at the end of last one, is just too much for one video. But as I go through this, I hope you'll hear that not only is love of enemies not impossible, but it's absolutely central to what it means to follow Jesus. From it, everything else follows. To explore that, we're going to have to look at a number of things. The structure of how Luke has shaped this, how Luke presents this differently than Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, and what images Luke uses here to explore the meaning of what love of enemies might look like in real life. So let's just jump in with looking at the right side of the screen. We see the chiastic structure of this section here. I haven't put the verse numbers up on this as I have on some of the chiasms, but you can see them on the left side as we go, starting in verse 27 and the repetition of love your enemies here. And this is as far as we're going to get in this video. Even though I think the chiasm continues into this section down here, this will be enough to cover for now. And so what we see is that Luke, unlike Matthew, repeats it, frames this entire section around love of enemies, and puts the golden rule, so-called, do to others as you would have them do to you, at the center. And surrounding the golden rule, in between the love of enemies, are examples. So in this first section here, we see these are examples of what it means to love, to do good, to bless, and to pray for. And then the question in the second half is how wide a scope of the people that one is called to do these things as Jesus envisioned here. And so we'll look at those pieces individually as we go. And I want to remind, as we've been doing in this Sermon on the Mount, there are two cultural contexts we've been exploring this in. One is that of Greco-Roman panegyrics, and we've seen this in the introductory video to the Sermon on the Mount from Louis Nadeka from Malawi, who highlights how in public orations at funerals or at coronations or other public gatherings, Greek orators would often name the values that held them together, that provided unity as a culture, as an expression of the ongoing power of the status quo. Whereas in the Jewish tradition, in the Bible, the kind of echo we are hearing in Luke's Sermon on the Plain is of the covenant blessing and curses, examples in Leviticus 26 and 28, which is to say how people live well with each other and with the earth, according to God, both in the Hebrew Scripture and Jesus here. So another thing I want to look at as we start is how Matthew takes some of these same elements and moves them around. And I'm not suggesting moving around from Luke. Again, in the introductory video, I opened up just a little bit the question of what's the relationship between Matthew's Sermon on the Mount and Luke's Sermon on the Plain. One thing we can say, again, worth repeating, is we have no idea whether one is using the other or whether they both are starting from some separate source. So the parts that are underlined here are the parts that are different in Luke or Matthew, but we can't say that one's the original and one is not. What I really want to focus on here is what we're seeing in sequence in Luke here is in a wildly different order in Matthew. So I followed the blue parts here in order, and we see verse 27, 28, and 29 as we go here. But we see Matthew, love of enemies is in 544, and then it's back to 539, and that's a typo, unfortunately, 540, and then 542, and then 612. So when we look at the Sermon on the Mount structure, we can see it's organized by a very different principle in this section. From 521 to 48 is Jesus' word regarding justice, and it follows upon his word about fulfilling the law and the prophets rather than abolishing it. Matthew presenting Jesus as another Moses going up the mountain to get the word from God. And so what he's doing in this section is a series of triads of showing what a traditional rule was that allowed for some kind of violence, the root cause of that violence, and Jesus' alternative to the original rule, trying to get to the root of what the rules in the Torah were meant to dissuade. It's something like the difference between passing laws against being racist in accommodations or in hiring versus actually trying to get the demon of racism out of people's hearts. So Luke is doing it very differently here and concludes this section with the famous be perfect, better translated be complete as your heavenly Father is complete. And then he has a whole other section about renouncing righteousness before people in favor of righteousness before God. And we see that section here, and then renouncing worldly treasures there. So Luke's version is oriented in a very different shape. Here, as we've seen in the whole picture of the Sermon on the Plain here, it starts with the Beatitudes and the Woes, which you've been looking at, has this section here, which, as I've listed here, is representing the scope of discipleship practice, of how widely does one have to practice love all the way to one's enemies, for example, and then these parables at the end, some of which again overlap with Matthew, but in a different order. So it's important that we don't have Matthew's Sermon on the Mount in our head as we look at Luke's version of it here. So it starts off with, I say to you that listen, and he's been speaking to the disciples. We saw that early on up here, that when he first started speaking, he said he looked up to the disciples and said. But now that we're down here, he says, I say to you that listen. And does that mean the entire crowd, or does that mean only some people among the disciples are listening? Throughout Luke's gospel, the theme of listening, hearing, and doing is key. So to those who listen, he's suggesting this. And as my note below says, John Topol, whose work we've been using on this, I showed his picture in his book two times ago, notes that to interpret this as a different audience misses the point of who this is addressed to. That's also addressed secondarily to disciples who are rich, fat, mirthful, and praised by this world, and to outsiders typo there, who come to hear. So at this point, we don't have a reason to believe that all of the group of multitude of disciples are economically or spiritually poor. And we know that's going to be the case because Jesus is going to address later when you throw a banquet or things like that, that obviously imply that people have enough wealth to do that. So certainly some of the disciples are among the wealthy, although this section is not about wealth. So love your enemies. This is, interestingly, the first use of the verb agapao in Luke, and it's used a number of times. Let's take a look at love in Luke. First, the verb agapao, and curiously, the noun agape is only used one time, there in 11:42. And I want to highlight an element of this. I won't go through this in detail, as with some of the other verbal charts that I have for this session. But to love your enemies, we need to know what he means by love and what we mean by enemies. And so we see in this immediate section, if you love those who love you, and we'll get to that in a minute. Right after the Sermon on the Plain, we see an example of a centurion who said to love our people, Israelite people, the people of this particular synagogue, and it is he who built our synagogue. Not literally, but as a patron, sponsoring it. So we'll come to that example. And then here's love that comes out of canceling debts, and we'll see that's connected with the role of lending and money here, perhaps surprisingly to our cultural context. Then there's the woman who comes to the house of Simon the Pharisee and whose sins are forgiven, and therefore she shows greater love. And the lawyer here cites the commandment from the Shema about loving the Lord your God from Deuteronomy. And woe to the Pharisees who love to have the seat of honor. And this is a very unusual use of agapao. One normally wouldn't think of agapao as connected with public praise like this. Usually agapao is the kind of love that means you're caring more for the other. So Jesus is using it a little perversely here, as we'll see. And it's connected directly here with what follows here, 5 chapters later, what follows in the sequence of you cannot serve God and wealth or mammon. You either hate one and love the other, or devoted to one and despise the other. So in relation to God and wealth. And so we're going to see that that question of wealth is clearly a part of an expression of love. And finally, in terms of the noun agape here, woe to you Pharisees, you neglect justice and the love of God in favor of your ways. As I've been saying throughout chapter 5 and 6, this is another expression of the Pharisees' new way, and in contrast with Jesus' old way, their attempt to sew their new cloth onto the old cloth, but it tears off. So when we go back and look at this here, we see that what he's starting off with is this expression of agape, or agapao here, in relation to enemies. And the word for enemy is ekthros, or plural ekthroi. We see it a number of times here. But as, again, Topol points out, all the Lucan uses of ekthros refer not to a Christian's personal enemy, but to the enemy of the people of God. And it's really important that we hear this, that this is addressed collectively. The entire biblical message about sin and forgiveness and love is about the people of Israel in relation to each other, but also in relation to other peoples out there. And as we saw last time, Jesus' condemnation and woes applied to cities like Chorazin and Bethsaida. So this is about collective enemies, not one's personal enemy. And it's also a contrast, as we'll see later, not in this video, but perhaps in the next one, about a collective way of life, that Israel is meant to be, in Matthew's version, a light to the nations. Luke doesn't have that part, but clearly the discipleship community is meant to be a model, an expression of Jesus' way. So it's not just about individual people showing character, as one might expect from a Platonic view, or from early Christian writers like Clement of Alexandria, who certainly saw virtue as denying passion and refining oneself into something like a sculpture of virtue. But that perspective is not what Luke's doing here. despite his audience's familiarity with the Platonic view, although not with Clement, who was a century after the Gospel, roughly. So love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. And we've already seen hate, so let's note how this is already replying to what we saw up here in the Beatitudes, where we saw, blessed are you when people hate you. And so that's from one perspective. When people hate you, you're blessed. But what you're supposed to do when people hate you is do good to them. And when they curse you, which is very similar to revile you or defame you, which is to speak evil about you in public, to bless them. And then when they abuse you, which is also within the same category, and we'll look at the word for abuse, I might as well look at it right here, eperezo, which, as the Low Needle Lexicon suggests, to mistreat with the implication of threats and abuse, the response there is to pray for them. So all of these things come together. And what makes this not as difficult as people can sometimes make it sound like is what's central to this. I'm jumping over the green parts for now, getting to the golden rule. Do to others as you would have them do to you. And in a minute, I'm going to look at some variations on the golden rule so we can see what Jesus is not saying. And we can also see how this principle is expressed in similar ways in many cultural contexts, both other religious and philosophical contexts, as we'll see. But the basic point we need to understand here, as I've shown before about love and hate, is these are not emotional words. These are stance words. To love somebody does not mean to be really fond of them or to feel affection for them necessarily. It can certainly include that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. It can mean that you care more for them than you care for yourself, that you see them as part of your own self. And to practice love, and again, note that Luke is using this mostly as a verb, agapao, is to take a stance that you have the power of, as people made in the image of God with free will, as we see from Genesis 1, to choose what you're going to do in life. And again, this is not a new principle. We saw in Deuteronomy repeatedly in those covenant blessings and curses that Moses presents in God's name. I've set you for you good and evil, life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life. And so the basic human choice in the Bible, Hebrew Scripture, New Testament, is to choose how to be. And Jesus says, choose to love. And the reason it's important to love enemies is to say the enemies are the people most likely to have the power to push you out of the stance of love. Because when people present themselves as enemies, whether those are national enemies, communists, or terrorists, or wherever that might be in a given cultural context, or personal enemies, one's response is often to want to destroy them, to treat them the way they are treating you. But Jesus' message is if you're going to be a person of love, then you can choose to be a person of love regardless how other people act. And as we'll hear at the end, that's true about God, and so it ought to be true about Jesus' followers who are attempting to live out the call to be people made in the image and likeness of God. And so this call to love, to do good, to bless, and to pray for is to say one does those things simply because that's the kind of person one is choosing to be. Not just once, but constantly. Every encounter, every moment that we see. And as we look in the detailed notes here, we'll see how that comes out perhaps a little more closely. So, bless those who curse you. The word for bless here, eulogetai, from the root eulogio, which I noted when we looked at Makarios, and it's translated at the beginning of this section as, blessed are you, is not the normal word for bless. This is the normal word for bless, and it's a number of times in Luke as we see. Bless those who curse you, and this is the only time the word keteromenos is used in Luke. It's used in the parallel in Matthew 5:44. And in Mark 11:21, a different context. But only here, bless those who curse you and pray for those who abuse you. So as I was just noting, these are all equally called upon to just be that kind of person. But then he gets into these examples, and I want to at least get through these examples and the golden rule and the inclusion of opponents before we stop for today. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. Note how this is different than Matthew's version. So Matthew's version is anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek. And I won't try to explain Matthew's version here, but plainly part of the point of the right cheek is to say if someone slapped you, that's an insult as well as violence, and so by turning the other cheek, you're presenting yourself as an equal. But Luke's word here for strike is not the same word for slap, tuptamte. It simply means to hit. So it does not imply slap necessarily, like the backhanded slap that would be an insult, and he doesn't specify which cheek. So Luke's not concerned so much with the issue of dignity there as Matthew is, but with simply the issue of personal violence, if someone's attacking you with personal violence. And unlike Mark's version where he says turn the other cheek, Luke's version has offer the other cheek, or perico, literally to give up, offer, present, grant, or show, according to that lexicon. And so, as Topol notes here, indicates the kind of action that challenges the other to reflect on his action and be converted to a more authentic relation to his neighbor. Whether Jesus is intending this action to be evangelical in that sense, that it's offering a witness to other people to invite them to change, one can agree or disagree with Topol on that. It's certainly, though, about the person who's being spoken to here, the person being struck, not being changed by the other. And perhaps, well, the hope that the other would also be changed by your witness. And then following, if anyone takes away your coat, whereas Matthew had, if anyone wants to sue you to take your shirt. The two kinds of clothes here are the hemadion for the coat and the ketona for the undershirt. Again, this is a typo, I'm sorry. It should be your coat as well, not your coast. So Matthew has it reversed. It has, if someone wants to take your undershirt, give them your coat as well. Whereas Luke has, if someone takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. The coat, the hemadion here, was not just a coat. It's also a sleeping garment in the sense of rolling it up as a pillow, and it can be used to hold things with, and it's a basic outer layer that people see, whereas the keton is what's underneath that. And so if someone is coming at you with the violence of taking, don't hold back. Just give them all of it. And there's the implication here, as there was in Matthew, that the response is you'd be standing there naked and that would shame your opponent. But Luke doesn't get into the details of that. And then in this one here, the last one before the golden rule, he changes it a little more too. Here he has give to everyone who begs, whereas Matthew had give to the one who asks. And the word for beg here, tunte, which is the theme of asking and giving. But important here also is the give to everyone. Notice that Matthew simply says give to the one, but here the use of panti from the root pas, as Topol notes out, it refers to every request for money or possessions, day in and day out, from that of the beggar to that of the rich friend. And it's a shocking thing for any of us who live in cities where there are homeless people out. Every time we go outside, it means don't go by any homeless person or anybody in need if they're asking you for money. That's really quite the demand. It's what my friends in the Catholic Worker call street tax, that if you're going through the territory where people live on the street, then you need to pay them the tax, just like you pay taxes on the road to the state that maintains the roads. So one way of looking at the invitation to give to everyone who asks for money from you. And this will come back on the other side, as we see in the question of lending, in the other side of and this one here on the other side of the chiasm here, where lending is parallel to that. So give to everyone who begs from you. If anyone takes away your goods, which is not in the Greek here, if anyone takes away from you, do not ask for it again. It's a rare word for asking back here. And as Topol again notes, the verb implies an element of demand or force. So in other words, don't ask for it back by force. One could ask for it politely, but if someone takes it away, just let it go. Notice how this is all about just letting go, not letting what other people do, whether that's violence, physical violence, or theft, or demand for something that they want or need, to change you from being the kind of person that you're committed through the word of Jesus to be. And at the center, we get to the golden rule. And I want to look at some variations on the golden rule, both from other traditions and from more recent elements, cultural elements to highlight this. So this is Jesus' version. The Talmud, which is written after the time of Jesus, but is certainly not intending to be expressing something new, has this similar, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow man. This is the law. All the rest is commentary. Confucius, from an earlier time, do not do to others what you do not want them to do to you, the negative version of it. Zoroaster, the founder of Zoroastrianism, the Persian state religion for many centuries, that character is best that doesn't do to another what isn't good for itself. Similarly in Buddhism, hurt not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful. And then from Aristotle, more relevant to Luke's audience, we should conduct ourselves toward others as we would have them act toward us. And you can see similarly with Hindu scripture, but then we have George Bernard Shaw, who has an interesting variation on it, famously as an atheist, but that's not the point here. The point is this, what he says, do not do unto others as you would have, as you would that they should do unto you. Their tastes may not be the same. And some philosophers have challenged Jesus' word on this as saying, people have different variations on what they want to have done, and so that might not be a great rule, and that leads some to have this rule, known sometimes as the platinum rule, which I got off a website of an educator working with students in the classroom, to do to others as they would have you do to them, which is to say, to imagine what they would want you to have you do and do that. In other words, not what you want to have done, but what they want to have done. But there are also some others here that are the negative versions of it, in the sense that they are very different than Jesus' version. Do to others before they do to you, which is the stance we often have in warfare, where we're defending and building up warfare before somebody else attacks us. Or another one, do to others as they have done to you, which is the reactive form that we see so often in politics. They bombed us, so we have to bomb them back, as happened after 9/11. So plainly, Jesus' version is the most radical of all, and it's a real challenge to have that at the center here of the Sermon on the Plain, because it makes this completely unconditional. There are no exceptions here. There are no but if or but in other circumstances. It's simply presented as that's how it is. And at the risk of going a little long, I just want to finish this section because it's all parallel here, and so it shouldn't take us very long to do that, these three examples. And notice I've shown here in the green, you can see how exactly parallel they are. What credit is that to you 3 times? For even sinners, do the same, and one variation on that in each time. So if you love those who love you, what credit is that? If you do good to those who do good, what credit is that? If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that? Let's look a little closer at the language of that. So the phrase here for what credit indicates a kind, as Topol notes, what kind of credit is that to you? And further, he notes that the word charis here, used here, is usually the word for a gift, but it's often connected with the reciprocity code, which is exactly what Jesus is railing against here, which is the norm in the Greco-Roman culture. So Topol goes on to note, one might hear this more closely in this. If you love those who love you, what kind of a gift is that? You are merely absolving a debt and so returning the relationship to equilibrium. You have no credit with the other. And what he's playing on there is the question of credit in terms of reciprocity, even though charis doesn't normally mean reciprocity. It means something as a gift. And so we have to get into this relation between balanced reciprocity and generalized reciprocity. Balanced reciprocity has to do with, I invited you over for dinner, so you're going to invite me over for dinner. I bought you a Christmas present, so you're buying me a Christmas present. Whereas generalized reciprocity has to do with one's behavior in general out there. I invite people invite me to dinner, so I invite people to dinner. Or I do good to people and people do good to me, without an immediate credit. But the balanced reciprocity was connected with the patronage system to make the Greco-Roman world run. It's how people knew who your friends were, in the formal sense of philos, friendship, of those who treat you the way you treat them. Not the way you want to be treated, but the way you have been treated. So that if you invite me over for dinner 3 times and I don't invite you again, you might stop inviting me. Or if I do good to you several times and you don't do good to me, I may stop doing good to you. That's the norm that Jesus is going against here. And so he's saying even sinners do that. And even though Jesus is welcoming sinners, he's using sinners in the sense as those, in my note down here, those whose lives are marked by the calculation of balanced reciprocity, that is, by a circle of exchange that turns gifts into debts. That from Joel Green. So in all 3 of these, he's highlighting you should be better than the sinners. The sinners, of course, that Jesus welcomes don't remain sinners. He's inviting them as sinners to be welcomed and then inviting them to stop being sinners. And sometimes we've seen that's already happened, like the woman in chapter 7. But here, it's just used as a low standard. In other words, doing things for reciprocity expectation is not give you any credit, because it's not a gift. This is all about being a gift. Which leads to the final example, which is paradoxical. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, well, isn't lending inherently not a gift? Lending is a loan and expect to be repaid. And the question is, hoping to receive just the loan back or helping to receive interest back? And that's what we see here in the last part of verse 34. Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again, or ta isa, the equal. And again, Topol helps us note that the gift aspect here would be an interest-free loan, which expects a return favor later, which is you loaned me some money so I could get through something, and I'll loan you some money so you can get through something without either of us expecting to pay interest on it. The idea of not loaning an interest to your own people is found in Leviticus. In fact, it's one of those covenant blessings that we referred to in 26, where if you don't practice that, bad things will happen to you. So the norm within Israel was to not loan to your fellow Israelites at interest, but you could loan to outsiders at interest. But Jesus is saying, don't even do that. Just give it. Just give it. Don't lend it at all. Just give it. Once you're talking about lending, you're expecting back in its reciprocity. So that's a lot to comprehend right now, and I hope I hope it makes some sense of it, but perhaps it'll make more sense of it when we finish the rest of the chiasm here next time. See you then. Bye-bye.